you've got a lot of Conservative voters who decided they're going to send the party a message that it needs to be more right-wing. So they vote for Reform. Reform wasn't really ready with all of its candidates and all of its organisation. So Reform was spread extremely thin and only got 4 seats, whereas the Liberal Democrats, who are very well organised in particular seats, picked them all up.
My name is Tom Switzer. I'm the Executive Director at the Centre for Independent Studies, and our guest here this evening is Eamonn Butler from the Adam Smith Institute. And can I say from the outset, it's always a great honour and pleasure for people like Eamonn and me to be speaking in front of individuals who do value freedom. I'm reminded of a conversation between a citizen of our country and a citizen of the People's Republic of China. The Australian described the freedom of speech that we have in Australia, and the citizen from China said, "We're free to speak in communist China, just like you are in Australia." And the Australian says, "Really?" And the Chinese guy says, "Yeah, the only difference is you're free after you speak." As you all know, we do plenty of events, and that brings us to this evening's event, The State of Britain. I thought we'd lead with this wonderful cartoon by Morland. Morland does the cover art for the UK Spectator. He's been doing it for the best part of 15 years, maybe longer. He also writes a cartoon for the Sunday Times. This was last Sunday's. It's Prime Minister Starmer visiting the Oval Office, talking about the need to use Western long-range missiles to strike at Russia. And Biden says, "Well, we risk direct war with Russia." To which Starmer replies, "Well, everything in Britain is broken anyway." Eamonn Butler, as I mentioned, he was a co-founder and he's the director of the Adam Smith Institute. He's written many books, some of which we've published or republished here at CIS, and they include The Best Book on the Market and, funnily enough, this was written in 2010, The Rotten State of Britain. Please welcome Eamonn Butler.
Now, you wrote that book, The Rotten State of Britain, in 2010. What was your thesis?
Well, I think it was at the end of the Gordon Brown era. And the thesis was, wherever you looked, health, education, welfare, public life in general, that things were not going very well and that we needed to do something radically different.
Have 14 years of Tory governance since you wrote that book, have things got worse in Britain?
Have we had Tory government in Britain?
We've had 5 Conservative Prime Ministers over 14 years.
Conservative Party Prime Ministers.
Well, tell us what's wrong with the
Have they been Conservatives? No, they haven't.
Why not?
Why not? I think it started with David Cameron, curiously, and he thought that he had to be all things to all people and that he would succeed by being middle of the road and very green and touchy-feely and all of these kind of things. And I think that what has happened is that ordinary Conservative supporters don't really share those kind of values. And so it was remarkable that when Cameron came in 2010, he formed a coalition with the Liberal Democrats. He didn't have to, and indeed the Liberal Democrats couldn't believe their luck at how generous the government was being to them. But and that has, if you like, gone on. And then we had various other prime ministers who tended to be quite centrist, and even Boris, who did enthuse the party membership, but really when he was actually in power, he talked all about the net zero and all of this kind of stuff, which I think the party members didn't really want to hear.
It's widely believed that Margaret Thatcher, under her tenure from 1979 to 1990, that she made the political weather, as the Brits say. She presided over a realignment of the political landscape, and the centre of gravity shifted to the right, so much so that the only way for Tony Blair and the Labor Party to get back in power was by moving in that direction. If that is indeed true, and that's the conventional wisdom, how do you account for the Tories moving in a more interventionist, big government agenda during its 14 years in power?
I think it's a lot to do with personalities. I think it's got something to do with the electoral system that the Conservative Party has. They've got this peculiar system, and I know why it arose. It arose because in the old days, the members of Parliament chose the leader. And the party membership said, well, that's a bit unfair. We don't, we're the guys that go knocking on doors and so on, and we don't get any say in the leader. So it was decided that what would happen is that the MPs would select two candidates. There'd be various stages, and they'd select two candidates, and they would put these to the party membership. But as always, there's a sort of right-wing candidate and a left-wing candidate. And the party membership vote for the right-wing candidate, the Boris or the Liz Truss and so on. And the members of Parliament think, we can't work with this person, we need a more establishment sort of person, we need the other guy. So it's a very unstable situation, and I think they've got to change that.
I mean, Brexit happened in 2016. This was the British decision to leave.
It happened in 2016.
Well, the Brits voted for Brexit in 2016 and eventually happened. But wasn't Brexit designed? I mean, wasn't there supposed to be a Brexit dividend by overhauling economic regulations? Why didn't that happen?
Yes. Well, I remember Brexit night. Well, firstly, there were two memorable events on Brexit night. The first was when I got invited to the Leave party in London. And so I went along, and everybody was very, very glum because they all thought that they had been lost by a major majority, because that was what all the opinion polls were saying and all the newspapers were saying. And so it was a very glum, downbeat affair. And about midnight, Nigel Farage came in, surrounded by bright lights and cameras like this, you see. And he gave a little talk saying, well, it looks like we haven't won this time, but nevertheless, the fight goes on. And I phoned up my wife, who's in Cambridge, where we live, and I said, you might as well go to bed, dear. If Nigel Farage is saying it's all over, then it's all over. We're not going to win. Anyway, I got a call at about 5:30 in the morning. You cost me the most exciting night of my life. So that was one thing. And the other thing was at about 3:30 in the morning, I saw it on the recordings the next time, where the mathematics of it were incontrovertible, that the presenter on BBC said, well, that's it, we're out. But we're not out.
Yeah. I mean, to what extent are there regrets among Brexiteers about the vote in 2016, given that it hasn't yielded the kind of positive consequences that many supporters of Brexit hoped for?
Well, if you look at the opinion polls say that yes, a lot of people now think that Brexit was a mistake. Why do they think it's a mistake? Well, they think it's a mistake because we haven't actually delivered it. We haven't got it yet. In fact, if you look at the figures, we're growing much faster than the rest of Europe. Yep. And inflation's lower and all the rest of it. Our debt, even
that's a key point. So on those key issues like debt, unemployment, inflation, the UK figures are better than continental Europe.
Yeah.
So
you don't hear that much. We're actually doing very well. Yeah. But you never believe that from the public debate, because the public debate is dominated by Remainers or Remoaners.
Yeah.
Remoaners.
But talking about Remoaners and the backlash against Remoaners, the 2019 general election, Boris Johnson won a thumping parliamentary majority in 2019. And that, of course, was on a pledge to finalise Britain's departure from the EU. But what else did Boris Johnson's agenda consist of?
Yeah, that's very hard to identify, actually, because I think Boris was elected, and certainly among Conservative members, there was a great enthusiasm for Boris because he was a vote winner, as much as anything. And
he never lost an election, I don't think.
No, of course not. And and he was charismatic and all the rest of it. And to some extent, a lot of people liked Boris because they just hated routine politics, this middle-of-the-road, stuff. And Boris was something different. Boris spoke his mind. But I'm not sure he really had a plan. If he did have a plan, it was a sort of free market plan. But then, poor man, he got married. And
again,
yeah,
that's right.
Yes, well, we don't know how many children he's got or how many times he's been married. Actually.
I'm sure he does either.
and she
Kerry.
she pushed him in the direction of, oh, we've got to be green and net zero and all of this kind of stuff. And I think then the Conservative Party voters started.
But it was a remarkable effort by Johnson to win over the so-called red wall of traditional blue-collar Labor working-class voters. I mean, he really smashed the red wall in that election.
Yes.
But they've gone back to Labor, is that right?
But yes, but Mrs. Thatcher did exactly the same. Mrs. Thatcher in the
83.
In 79, really, that she picked up an awful lot of votes in the industrial north of England because they liked a strong leader, they liked somebody who knew where she was going, and they didn't really like ordinary run-of-the-mill politicians.
Now, talking about Margaret Thatcher, Liz Truss, who replaced Boris Johnson in 2022, she did champion a Thatcherite economic message that the party, the Tories, and indeed the UK, had not heard from the Conservatives in years. You had tax cuts topping her agenda.
Yes.
She stressed that economic growth rather than economic redistribution should solve Britain's problems, and that private enterprise can do it better than government direction. This is our language, of course, Eamonn. She also pushed back against the woke pieties that have swept the United Kingdom media, cultural, academic establishment, just like it has across the United States and to some extent in this country. Yet she lasted in number 10 for, 40 to 45 days. The question here is the failure of her agenda also a failure of people like us?
No. There were some strange circumstances to that. That Boris had introduced an £80 billion. Now, I don't know what £80 billion means in this country, but in the UK, it's a lot of money, right? Actually, when I worked on Capitol Hill,
In Washington.
I swear I heard the telephone engineer saying, testing, 1 billion, 2 billion, 3 billion. But £80 billion is an awful lot of money in the public budget. And so Boris introduced this £80 billion package to help households pay their rising energy bills. And that had been sort of accepted. And it was in place and nobody really questioned it. And Liz wanted to reduce taxation, but I think she sort of felt, well, that's a given. We can't really do anything about that. So let's start reducing taxation. So a lot of people were saying, well, the books don't really balance. You've got this £80 billion spending and you're cutting taxes. And her view is, and I think she was actually probably quite right, when you cut tax, you're going to lose some revenue in the short term. In the long term, it's going to help you, right? Because you're going to foster a growing economy. And basically, it's 2 or 2.5 year gap between those two things. And so her view was, crumbs, we've got an election coming up in 2.5 years. So we've got to do this now, right? And we've got to be radical and do it now. And I think, she didn't have time to soften up her own troops and to say, this is why we're doing it, and so on. So she got this big package. She was trying to promote tax cuts without softening up her own troops. The markets shrieked. And
Pound fell.
And although it was higher than it is now, but the Bank of England basically pulled the plug on her.
Yeah.
Because there were all sorts of problems.
But so she's been condemned for fiscal recklessness, if you like, in the sense that she didn't have funded tax cuts. But why is it different now for the current government when you have a Chancellor, Rachel Reeves? I think she delivers their first Labor budget next month. Big spending policies, but they're unfunded as well, correct? So why won't that have the same impact on the pound and the markets?
Oh, because they're a nice, touchy-feely Labour government. It won't have any effect at all, obviously.
Well, she's proposing tax increases to pay for the revenue. Can she find the revenue from those tax increases?
I can't see that she can, because Labour came in and she was saying, well, there's a £22 billion black hole in the public finances. Well, the Bank of England didn't know that. and the Office for Budget Responsibility has never said anything, and the Institute for Fiscal Studies has never said any of that. But anyway, there you are. Actually, 9.4, but nearly half of that 22 billion black hole was the extra money that she was going to pay for public servants, like the junior doctors getting a 24% rise, and the one that people really
24% rise.
Yeah, and the one that people really hate, which is the teachers getting a 13% rise.
Wow.
When during COVID the teachers were staying at home and not doing it, so they don't really have a great deal of support. So I think that she's introduced these spending plans, and I think boxed herself in because she said, well, we're not going to make any major changes to capital gains tax or to VAT, except of course to put VAT on private school fees or income tax. We're not going to change. So where else do you go? Those are the big revenue earners. So I think she's going to have great difficulty raising any more cash.
Okay. We'll get to questions soon enough if anyone wants to ask questions about the Labor's economic agenda. But just talking about Labor and power, they have a majority, a very big majority. I think they have 2/3 of the Commons. Yeah. That's extraordinary. And yet they only won 33% of the vote. How does that work? I want to repeat that. They won 33% of the vote on July 4, and they have 2/3 of the Parliament.
Yeah. Well, that's the first past the post system. It does that kind of thing.
I say this because a lot of left-leaning commentators are complaining about the American political system where Trump is less than likely going to get a majority vote, but he may well still win because of the electoral college system. And people are saying that's unfair. But you look at this, 2/3 of the parliamentary majority, and yet with only 1/3 of the vote.
America is not unfair. The electoral college system is there for a very good reason, and the founding fathers, as they were, thought about that long and hard before they instituted it. And the idea is that, well, you can't have a populist president who wins the big centres of population, but can't carry the rest of the country. So that's there for a good reason. And first past the post has very good reasons for it, that you know who your member of parliament is, and you can vote them out and so on. So it's not like coalition politics in Europe where lots of people vote the other way and then one or two people change in the coalition.
Yeah, but Eamonn, let me put this to you. The Liberal Democrats have 70 seats or thereabouts, 70 seats in the Commons. They only got 12% of the parliamentary vote. Yeah. The vote, right? Yeah. Whereas the Reform Party has 5 seats in the Commons, and they won 14% of the vote.
Well, what you've got to remember, firstly, you've got a divided right. You've got a lot of Conservative voters who decided they're going to send the party a message that it needs to be more right-wing. So they vote for Reform. But Reform was sort of rushed into an election. It didn't. Rishi had an election much earlier than people had imagined it was going to be, which you can do in the UK. And so Reform wasn't really ready with all of its candidates and all of its organisation. So Reform was spread extremely thin and only got 4 seats, whereas the Liberal Democrats, who are very well organised in particular seats, picked them all up. But that was it. I always say, I think this is going to be a one-term government.
Wow. A one-term government with a massive parliamentary majority?
Yes, because it's not, they haven't got a massive majority because they're popular. They've got a massive majority because the Tories are very unpopular. And in fact, they won, just over, nearly 33%, but just over 32% percent of the vote, which was the lowest percentage of the vote won by any winning party since the Second World War. It was even lower than what Corbyn got when he was defeated.
That's interesting.
And now
can we just repeat that? Starmer's Labor Party, that's now in government, got fewer votes than Jeremy Corbyn in 2019.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's right. And, so
that is fascinating. I mean, to be fair to Starmer, though, hasn't he purged the Labor Party of these left-wing reactionaries and anti-Semites that were emboldened by Corbyn?
Yeah, well, good luck with that. I think they're still around. How are they still around? Yeah, but you see, he did that by not having any policies. All he had to do was to be not the Conservatives, and then people would vote for him. So it's not a party that has been elected on popular enthusiasm. It's been elected on rejection of the other guys. And in fact, their popularity now is down to 30%. Now, you know, when it comes to honeymoons being over, that honeymoon is over. And it took Mrs. Thatcher 2 years to get there. It took Blair and Brown 3 years to get down as far as 30%. So,
No, that's interesting.
So
Now,
as they're now discovering that they're not popular.
So during the summer, we had these riots across England, mainly northern England, but they were in other parts of Britain. And I want to put up a quote. This is Simon Heffer, who's been a guest speaker at CIS, and he will be also our guest in the new year. Simon's a distinguished professor of history at the University of Birmingham, and he's been a prominent columnist and editor at the UK Spectator, the Telegraph and the Mail. And this is a quote: "The lawlessness that gives Britain such a dystopian feel, the marauding shoplifters, the Rolex rippers, the smartphone thieves, the lethal parade of teenagers with knives whose conception of the value of human life is apparently non-existent. This is an emergency every bit as grave as the riots last month." What is going on in Britain right now, Eamonn?
Well, a lot of people think that is down to immigration. That people see something like 45% of the population see immigration as being the major issue in politics. And yet we've been very accommodating. We've allowed lots of people in and lots of people to stay. And and there is some truth that we've been importing people who are basically Albanian gang members and other people who certainly don't share our traditional liberal values and tolerance and all the rest of it. So I mean, you've got five members of Parliament. Labour members of Parliament, nominally, but who were elected on a sort of pro-Palestine point of view. And there's
Didn't help George Galloway, though.
No, well, he's beyond redemption. But there's a huge millions of Muslim population, some of whom don't necessarily share liberal values. In fact, quite the opposite. So I think that's leading to tensions, and then people are saying, well, it's immigration. That's why we're all so lawless.
Yeah, but your critic would
But
say,
then if the police don't turn up at burglaries and don't turn up with shop thefts, what are you going to do?
our critics on the left would disagree with that, and they'd say that there's a lot of disinformation and racism in Britain. This is Jonathan Freeman in The Guardian. Let me run the quote by. He's actually blaming the British summer riots on Elon Musk. No, this is the argument. He says, Friedland, the hatred of the far right rioters was spread by lies on X. Now, what he meant by that was that this wicked stabbing attack on this this children's dance party in Southport, according to X, this was spreading like wildfire, that this was the result of a Muslim immigrant who had come to Britain on a small boat. So to what extent is the likes of Elon Musk and X and social media responsible for whipping up this xenophobia and racism across Middle England?
Unquestionably it does, but at the same time, do you believe in free speech or don't you? And you can have social media that's basically censored by the good-thinking people in California, or you can have anybody expresses their own opinion. I think probably we have to deal with these problems in the long term and work out ways to deal with them and to accommodate them, and indeed to maybe discount arguments more than we do. But at the same time, I'm a free speech fundamentalist. I'm sorry.
Okay, talk about free speech and free movement. Do you think Starmer will ban smoking?
Well, this is already happening.
How's it happening?
Well, Rishi Sunak introduced a bill into Parliament which said that nobody born after a certain time before a certain time could buy cigarettes, right? So on a certain date, if you're 18, you can't buy cigarettes, and you can't buy them when you're 19 and 20 and 21 and 22.
Jacinda Ardern, I think, tried to do this in New Zealand, didn't she?
The New Zealand guys tried to do that, and then they realised this is madness. This is not going to work, so they didn't do it. And after the demise of the Conservatives, I thought, well, thank goodness that's the end of that nonsense, because what it meant was that in 20 years' time, somebody who was 41 could buy cigarettes, but somebody who was 40 couldn't, you see. And you think, well, I'm against that in terms of the rule of law, right? Because that is treating people differently.
Yes.
And, it doesn't matter whether you like cigarettes or you don't, it's treating people differently. But this legislation has been taken up by the Labour Party. And they say, oh, for goodness sake, I just thought we'd got rid of that. Because it's deaf. And a lot of local shopkeepers, say, well, it's impossible for us because we're going to have to ask for the ID of people even if they're, 70.
Let's go back to the Conservative Party and we'll get the next quote up, Max. The next quote is from Dominic Green, who's a fellow at the British Historical Society. And this quote is that the long rhythm of British politics is now against the Conservatives, Eamonn. This is the quote. British voters stick with a party until it achieves total incompetence. This usually takes about 13 years. The Conservatives ruled from 51 to 64. Labor, with a Conservative interlude, from 64 to 79. The Conservatives from 79 to 97, and Labor from 79 to 2010. The Conservatives are now in year 14, and they've imploded on schedule. Exile awaits. So the question here is, are we witnessing the strange death of Tory England?
No, the Conservative Party is remarkably resilient, actually. And it's if you look at the Conservative Party today, it really includes a lot of what, in the end of the 19th century, early beginning of the 20th century, would call themselves liberals. So the Conservative Party absorbs different movements. And of course, it depends to some extent on what happens in the leadership election and who sets the agenda for the party after that.
Which will be resolved in a few weeks' time, correct?
Yes, it's going to the party conference in 2 weeks' time and then to the membership. Right. So it'll, we'll know in a few weeks.
Well, on that note, do you think, and this is a difficult question to answer, but given everything we've talked about and everything you've followed in British politics over the last few years, do you think that the Tory party will be led by, in the new era, someone like Nigel Farage, that is more interventionist and populist, or someone like David Cameron and Rishi Sunak, who's more of a wet Tory, or someone like Margaret Thatcher and Nigel Lawson, a free marketeer and a classical liberal?
Well, if you're asking me what I would like, I think this must be a trick question because I'd like Lawson and Thatcher.
Of course, well, like us. But what do you think?
Well,
will
I
happen?
think Kemi is a bit like that.
Kemi Badenoch.
Yep. Kemi Badenoch.
Whose family, or she originally from West Africa, correct?
Yes. I forget exactly where, but yeah.
Nigeria,
is
that's
it?
right.
And
And she used to work at The Spectator.
She did, yes, that's right. Oh, no, she's very good. Well, there's sort of two leading candidates, Robert Jenrick and her.
Tom Tugendhat?
Well, he's, I suppose, the establishment candidate. I'm sure all the members of Parliament would love to see him.
Well, Charles Moore says that Tom, who, by the way, wrote a paper for CIS.
Oh, right.
In, I think, March, April, May of 2021. A very comprehensive paper basically saying that Britain, America and Australia should form even closer security ties and propose the idea of nuclear submarines. This is true. We're proud of this. It was a pre-runner for AUKUS. And Tom is one of the leaders of one of the three candidates, as you mentioned. But Charles Moore says that Tom, who's a friend, was the only candidate to emphasise the word freedom in his Tory leadership campaign launch speech. And you're saying he's an establishmentarian. Yeah.
We know where Kemi stands. She doesn't have to mention the word freedom or democracy or anything like that. We know where she's coming from, and so I think she would probably be my candidate. Okay. Where I am a member of the Tory party, which I'm not.
Next quote. This is very disturbing, but I have to put this to you. This is Alistair Heath. Next quote. Alistair Heath, and this is the quote in the London Telegraph. Quote, the left's unprecedented control over Parliament, mentioned 2/3 of Parliament, is matched by its unparalleled grip over virtually every other powerful institution, the universities, cultural bodies, charities, the BBC, most of the broadcast media, quongos, the economic and financial regulators, the church, the police, and now even big business and woke capital. So the question here, Eamonn, is there anything to stop the left's long marches through Britain's institutions?
Yes. In 1979, we stopped that with Mrs. Thatcher, basically. And there's no reason why you can't do that kind of thing again. I don't accept the proposition that things are so bad they'll never get any better. It's up to us to make them better, quite frankly. And that's why, we do what we do, and I'm sure why you do what you do. And we are trying to convince people and put these arguments forward, and that's what we should be doing.
In light of everything that Heath says, the left is indulging in a sense of hubris. I want to run this by you. Mentioned Kemi Badenoch. This is David Tennant. Now, he's the actor who plays Doctor Who. David Tennant said a few weeks ago he wished Kemi Badenoch didn't exist anymore and that she should shut up because of her support for women's rights. This was all in the context of her opposition to the transgender for children. So in this brave new world, is she the one to speak for conservative and classical liberal Britain?
Well, I don't know that the opinion of an actor is really something that we should
got a lot of attention.
Take to be. Yeah, well, I know. Yes, I'm against actors making political statements like that for precisely that reason.
Yeah.
That they know absolutely nothing at all about the subject, but get a great deal of attention for doing it. Yes, I think she'd be a good candidate. I think she'd be an attractive candidate. Basically, because she's not in the mould. That's my trouble with Tom Tugendhat. He's in the mould of standard politics.
He's from the Tory Shires, so you think he's a bit wet?
Yes, a little. Yes.
Given your background with Scottishness, Austrian economists, and America, where do you see the Conservative Party in relation to going forward? Whether it should be conservative, classical, liberal, libertarian, and also on the economic versus social divide of being economically liberal versus socially conservative?
Well, when Cameron did his deal with the Liberal Democrats, I thought, it's going to be great because we're going to have Thatcherite economic policy and, liberal, proper social liberalism. In fact, we had exactly the opposite. We had left-wing economic policy, I think that's. I would love to see a Thatcherite economy, but I would love to see a liberal stroke libertarian social policy. That to me would be perfect.
But I mean,
and I think that would self-reinforce.
We at CIS broadly agree with that, but they're marginalised figures in the political realm across the Anglosphere, aren't they?
Before Mrs. Thatcher came into office, everybody assumed that, we were going to end up nearer to Eastern Europe than Western Europe, right? As it was then. And she reversed it. And it wasn't just her, it was a whole movement of people who reversed that. We can do this.
And we did the same thing in Australia under a Labor government, Bob Hawke and Paul Keating.
Yes, of course.
You know.
Yes, that's right.
Next question.
Hi, I'm just curious as to what you think about the future of the relationship between the Reform Party and the Conservative Party, whether the two parties will merge or whether the Conservatives will be pushed into irrelevance by Reform or somewhere in between.
And just to clarify for those who don't know, the Reform Party is led by Nigel Farage.
And it tends to be more populist. It tends to be more sort of anti-immigration, but otherwise it's kind of quite free market. Well, I think that I think the Conservatives have got to do a deal. There's no question about that. Whether Reform, now that it's got its own members of Parliament and so on, whether they would be interested in doing a deal, I don't know. They might feel that their party organisation is extremely thin, and therefore they're not likely to really pick up any large number of seats in the future. And and they've got they rush to get their current candidates in place, and some of those candidates are a bit flaky. So they don't really have too much of a party organisation. And I think what I would like to see is a Conservative Party which absorbs enough of the reform agenda, in other words, actually being conservative, in order to make reform redundant.
Next question.
Right. I noticed Simon Heffer's comment, and would comment that it's really dealing with the symptoms and not with the causes. It's not really getting into the causes, and the causes, I think, are largely cultural, and no one is addressing the cultural impact of what's going on. What sort of people are wielding knives? What sort of people are in jail? What is the actual impact of this massive immigration that's going on? There's some recent studies that's come out that shows, and I'm running on memory, that only 1 in 20 or so is making a constructive, is contributing more than they're costing. And the so-called expert immigration is 1%, if that.
Okay.
Your comment. Over to you.
Yeah, well, I think we do have a problem, and as I say, I mean, I think part of it is that a lot of people who have come to the UK don't really share British values of tolerance and so on. Indeed, quite the opposite. They think there is in particular a religious code which ought to be properly enforced. And so that has led to a lot of tensions. It's still a minority, obviously, but people, I think, are very concerned about that, and I think it has had a cultural effect. I think a much bigger cultural effect is down to things like the ruddy BBC, which
is our ABC, the public broadcasting.
Yeah, public broadcasting. So I mean, it's which just routinely, like the news isn't news anymore. I mean, if you want to hear the news in UK, you switch over to Euro News or one of these programs. Actually tell you what's going on. The BBC nightly newscast is people weeping in front of camera because their benefits have been cut off or something like that.
Yeah.
And this has. And the thing is, they don't even realise they're doing it. And they say, "Oh, we're impartial." So they don't realise how biased they are. So that's a cultural problem.
Anthony's point about Chesterton, it sort of reminds me of something that Irving Kristol, the founding father of American neoconservatism, said at the height of America's triumph in the Cold War when the Soviet Empire collapsed. He said that there's a lot of rot and decay germinating in American society. Yeah. And you could say the same thing about Britain.
Yes, but there's plenty of disinfectant available, and we can do something about that.
Okay, Cooper.
Sorry, maybe to latch on to that last point, suppose you're the newly elected Conservative Party leader. What is the disinfectant you propose? What's the policy platform? What do you take to the next election?
I'd be no good as a politician at all, right? Because my election slogan was "Vote for me, I want to leave you alone." And I think that's probably what people actually want to hear from their politicians. They're actually fed up of politicians. Well, firstly, they all seem to be the same. They all seem to be saying more or less the same thing, and they're interfering all the time, and they don't let people get on with their own lives. And I think that's that's one of the issues why people are just fed up with politics. So you look at things like Brexit, and in America you look at things like Trump and so on, and in Europe you look at alternative Germany and all the right-wing candidates. It's not that people are particularly right-wing or Trumpian or anything like that. It's just that they hate the soft porridge of contemporary politics, where everybody's saying more or less the same thing.
Who'd want to be a politician, though? I mean, Matthew...
Well, it's a dirty job, but somebody's got to do it.
Yeah, well, that's true. Matthew Parris, the former Tory MP and Thatcher advisor, who's a columnist with The Spectator and The Times, once told me that to be an MP is to feed your vanity and starve your self-respect. Next question. Yeah.
You mentioned the Liberal Democrats. Is there any real future role or purpose in their existence?
Future role for the Liberal Democrats?
Yes. Real role.
Oh, no. They're always going to be a party of protest, I think. I mean, they have, under our system, they do actually have quite a following. I mean, they get lots of votes.
Well, as I said, they got 12% of the vote, but they got 70 seats.
Well, that's right. So they do pick up quite a lot of
Yeah.
votes, and in particular when the state of the two main parties, Conservative and Labour, when that's settled and when one is far ahead of the other, then people can vote and do vote for Liberal Democrats as a sort of protest. We didn't want these guys. We'll vote Liberal Democrat. When things are more even, then Liberal Democrats get squeezed out, and so that's what's happened in recent elections. They've done no good at all because the elections have been tight.
Next question. Thanks.
We saw the quote there earlier of the reach of the left through BBC and universities and other various institutions. And I dare say I see the same here in Australia. We in this room feel that there's a better alternative. However, we still see in the polls, despite the mess of the Australian government, that Peter Dutton is only hitting 50-50 in the polls. At the end of the day, the Conservative leaders have to get people to vote for them. And it would appear that the influence is on the left. So where does the Conservative Party have to go to get people to vote for them?
Well, I think that you have to have principle and vision and direction that you're going in. I always say that I'm sure that 2/3 of the great British public hated Mrs. Thatcher's guts, right? But they still voted for her 3 different times because they knew where she was going. And they knew in their bellies that this was actually the right way to go, that you can't run a country by mounting up debts all the time. It's just like running a small shop or a small business or running a household, right? The books have got a balance at the end of the day.
Maybe the answer to the question is we need a crisis.
Oh, no.
Well, she
I'm
had the
not-
crisis of 79.
I'm not in favour of crises. Look, Ralph Harris, who started was the first director of the Institute of Economic Affairs, used to say that in the 1970s. He used to, things are going so badly under Wilson's government, the Labour government, that what we need is a good crisis, and then people would. Well, yeah, you never quite know what's going to happen after a crisis. That's the problem. It could go. Could go in any direction.
I mentioned the Basil Fawlty's Fawlty Towers.
Yeah,
and, when I was a kid watching it, I loved that movie. I love that sitcom so much, but I could never get the reference I do now to when things would go wrong around the hotel. And this was, of course, in the 1970s. Basil would yell at the sky and say, "Bloody Wilson!" Bloody Harold Wilson. Mark, you got a question? Next. Sorry.
Oh, hello. You talked about the failure to achieve a Brexit bonus. Yep. I'm sort of wondering, to achieve that, what sort of deregulation is required, and how would you sort of manage the European Union trading relationship as well as the border with Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland? What's the best way to achieve the Brexit bonus?
Well, Boris did something which is very unpopular on the Northern Ireland thing, which is basically to accept that Northern Ireland would be part of the EU customs union. So we've now got a customs border down the North Sea, and people in Northern Ireland are exceedingly irritated about that. And the EU's argument is that, well, we can't have anything other than that because people would import goods into Northern Ireland that would then be taken down to Southern Ireland, and then they're in the EU. See, so all sorts of things that we don't want in the EU because we're too busy subsidising our own producers for the most part. But all sorts of things that we don't want in the EU are going to leak down the border. And, the answer to that is, if you look at the eastern border of the EU, there's hardly any controls at all, right? And they want these massive controls. So, my point of view would have been, if you want to build a wall across Northern Ireland, on you go, mate, right? Because, you're going to find there's going to be a bit of trouble because we've left all that behind us. So that was clearly a mistake. And I think we found it hard to believe, as being, squishy Brits, that the EU would be so vindictive in its negotiations with us. And Keir Starmer is at the moment saying, we need to be closer to the EU and so on. And they're even now saying, oh, well, yeah, right, okay, we could do that. Well, you have to accept this and accept this. Oh, and we want some of the fisheries back as well. And you say, That's what we voted for, right? To have control of our own fisheries and our own laws and indeed our own regulations. So I think we've actually got to be much tougher because, you know, we're one of the largest economies in Europe and they need us. and, you know, we need to trade with them. So, you know, why don't you just see that, you guys? But they're so busy thinking we don't want anybody else to do what Britain's done. And, you know, it's bad for the project.
One of the difficulties in prosecuting us policies that are aligned with, say, small government is this increase in the public sector, and that's growing in Australia and growing in England. And so trying to get the turkeys to vote for Christmas is really difficult. So how do you tackle that? I guess that's when the public sector grows, it's really difficult to reduce it. And I say that as a newly minted bureaucrat, so possibly getting myself into trouble.
I thought Milton Friedman had a very good take on this, which is that it doesn't matter what any of the figures are, except for how much does government spend. You know, that's the crucial thing. So if government is spending, you know, 40-something% of the gross national product, then you got a problem. So I think we really need to focus on total spending. And then once you focus on that and try and get that down, then everything else will fall into place because it's got to.
I'm sure you would agree that the role of trade unions in the economy is very important and that one of the themes of Mrs. Thatcher's first and second governments was addressing the excessive power of trade unions in the British economy, and we remember the winter of discontent, and was one of the factors that led to her victory in 1979. But and the rest of the world would not be very well aware of what's going on in Australia, that we have had under the current Labor government here since May 2022 a major change in the legislation governing the role of trade unions, which has greatly enhanced the power of the trade union movement here and rolled back decades of deregulation of the labour market. And I might add that none of this was disclosed before the last election. It has all come as a surprise since the election. So I would just like to ask you, do you expect the same thing to happen in the UK? What is the nature of the relationship between the British Labour Party and the trade union movement now? And is there some unstated commitment by the Parliamentary Labour Party to change legislation to enhance the role of the unions there?
Well, there's some discussion of that, and I think that the fact that they've given 24% pay rise to hospital doctors and 13% to teachers, and then goodness knows how much to train drivers. All of these things rather unpopular, by the way. Might indicate that they understand that they must have a deep relationship with the trade unions, and that they want to foster that. But the UK has changed, right? I mean, the trade union movement is a pale shadow of what it used to be, because it used to be that we had an economy which was dominated by big government-run enterprises, firms. And now that's no longer true. We have lots and lots of small businesses and much less public ownership. So there's no foothold for them because those businesses are more interested in competition rather than in promoting trade unions.
So long gone are the days of Arthur Scargill old-style union thuggery.
I would like to think so, yes.
Yeah, okay. Next question.
Hi, thank you so much. One of the bills that we're concerned about here in Australia is the Combat Misinformation Disinformation Act. Now, there's obviously a lot of information that, or a lot of the news that we're seeing is that obviously there's already legislation like that in the UK where people are being hauled in front of courts because of posts they've made on social media. Is there much of a future for this kind of legislation in the UK? Is there any news about how this might be rolled back?
Well, I fear there is, and I think that this is something where we really do have to stand up on principle, and say it's wrong to imprison people for their views. It's simply wrong that we need a free debate and free discussion. And of course, a lot of people say, well, that's the trouble with the police. You see, they don't prosecute burglaries. They don't deal with knife crime or shoplifting and all the rest of it because they're too busy arresting people for political incorrectness. You see, and I think that is a strong wave there that you can capture and get on your side, I think. So it wouldn't surprise me if it gets worse before it gets better, but eventually it'll get better. I think we're beyond peak woke.
Next question, Freya.
Just before the election, Rishi Sunak proposed introducing national service for young people. 12 months of military service, or I think you could substitute that for some sort of civilian service. This is a debate that sometimes comes up in Australian politics as well. I'm just interested in what your thoughts are on that policy. Do you think it was a genuinely held sort of conviction policy, or was it a bit of a vote grabber?
I think it was one of the stupidest policies that I've ever heard. It was designed, I'm sure, to try to woo back Conservative voters who believe in, army and young people need discipline and all this sort of stuff, you see. Well, some of them say that. So I think that was what he was trying to do. But it's really very stupid when you look at it. Okay, how many people, reach the age of 18? Well, it's hundreds of thousands every year, right? What's the size of our army? Well, it's less than that, actually. So how are you going to get the army to absorb this enormous thing? And okay, well, they could do community service instead. Yeah, who's going to organise that, right? Local councils are already saying, we're stretched beyond. It was a very silly policy, and it was designed really to make Tory voters feel good and get them back into the fold.
Next question, Chris.
Alistair Campbell famously intervened when Tony Blair was asked about his religious views and said, "We don't do God." He obeyed him until he left office, and then he became a Catholic, and now he practices his religion. It's been said by Jordan Peterson and others that the problems that we face are not really political, they're theological. So my question is, and I'm biased because I'm a priest, but can there be any conservatism or classical liberalism without the Christian church, without reinvigorated Christian values? Is the Conservative Party suffering from the same lack of relevance that the church is?
This is a question which I always have trouble with because I have no religion. I'm an atheist. But at the same time, I think religion is so strong and so universal in every society. It must have some kind of evolutionary role, okay? So I don't do the God thing. I don't do faith or any of that. I say, why do we have religion? It must have some role. And I think the role is probably reinforcing a certain moral situation. But, my religion is liberalism. I think that it is the liberal values, which aren't necessarily the same as Christian values. Liberal values of self-help and enterprise and freedom of speech and justice. These things are what has created prosperous economies. Get that right first, and then your economy will float on that with no problem.
Next question, Tim.
Thanks, Tom. Eamonn, interesting comment then, because previously you talked about an influx of immigrants not sharing the same values of England, of the UK, similarly here in Australia. Those values referred to really as our Judeo-Christian values and virtues and our fundamental democracy, which is, in my belief, under challenge and under threat. But that's a comment. The question is AUKUS. We have a Harris possible presidency in America in November. We have a socialist Albanese and a socialist Starmer government. How do you see AUKUS playing out?
Well, I don't do defence, so I can't really tell you that. What I certainly do think is that there needs to be very much closer links between the countries of the Anglosphere. I would like to see it possible for young people to travel between those English-speaking countries without any visa or anything like that, and to work in them and all the rest of it. That's what I would love to see, because I think we have a mutual culture which is worth promoting among ourselves. And I think it is according to what you said earlier. I think that I wouldn't call it Judeo-Christian. Again, this is maybe my bias as an atheist, but I wouldn't call it that. But I would call it the virtues of justice and toleration and self-help and enterprise, and basically governments keep it out of the way. I mean, those are the values we need to do. And you can imagine that many people who come from much more tyrannical countries don't necessarily share those views.
Eamonn, it's this week is the 80th anniversary of the publication of Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. Friedrich Hayek, of course, being a prominent Austrian economist. Now, it's also been revealed that the American Economic Association, it has a long-standing tradition of honouring Nobel economists, and of course, Hayek won his Nobel Economics Prize in 1974, so 50 years ago this year. And but this year, for the next meeting, the panel of the American Economic Association rejected the proposal to honour Friedrich Hayek on the 50th anniversary of his Nobel Prize. But the annual AEA meeting will host sessions on diversity, equity, inclusion, inequality, gender, sexual harassment, discrimination, race, and LGBT, but nothing on one of the greatest free market economists of the 20th century. How do you account for this?
Because they've all got their snouts in the trough. They are paid by governments, and not surprisingly, they don't support smaller government. And I think this is a great problem in our academic world, that in so many countries, the majority of the universities, in some cases all of the universities, are state organizations. I want to see competition in education, just like I want to see competition in everything else. So
surely in the interest of political diversity, there's a case to honour someone like Friedrich Hayek at an Economic Association conference.
You would think so. Well, he can be controversial, I suppose.
Because he supports the free market economy.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, absolutely.
Is that controversial?
Oh, it is. Well, I gave a speech a few years ago to a group in Oxford University, and we were supposed to hold this meeting in the college, St Hugh's College, but and I was talking about Hayek, you see, but the subject of Hayek was regarded as being so controversial that a number of students might have an attack of the vapors, and so we had to move the meeting to the town hall. And I thought, what a spineless bunch! Hayek was the nicest, kindest, politest man you could ever meet, right? So, he's hardly a threat to humanity, I don't think.
Yeah, I'll never forget that 2012 Republican presidential primary. I think it was in either Iowa, the caucus, or New Hampshire, and a guy called Rand Paul, a libertarian Republican congressman, came second, and he gave this big speech to his supporters, and he said, 40 years ago, 1972, a Republican president, Richard Nixon, famously said, "We are all Keynesians now." Well, when I'm in the White House, I can't wait to say, "We are all Austrians now." Now I'd like to call on my colleague and friend Peter Curti to deliver some concluding remarks, including a vote of thanks. Please welcome Peter Curti.
Thank you very much. And Eamonn, thank you very much indeed. Tom cited a quote by Simon Heffer earlier, and Simon, as Tom said, is a friend of CIS and will be returning to CIS in a few months' time. But it was Simon Heffer who coined the notion of Basildon man in the early years of the Thatcher government. I can't remember whether it was in 79 or after 79, but Heffer conceived the idea of Basildon man as a young, hard-working man raising a family on the outskirts of London. He was undogmatic, but wanted things that really matter to be attended by government. Well, this week, The Economist is now flagging something called Stevenage Woman. Stevenage Woman is based on the new town of Stevenage, some 25 miles north of London. It was the first of the new towns built after the Second World War. And The Economist says that Stevenage Woman is also young, hardworking, undogmatic, and only cares about things that really matter. And you sort of think in a way that it just shows that what goes around comes around in politics. And I think in some ways, Eamonn, what you have done tonight is to flag how true that is, that governments come and go, fortunes ebb and flow, and that the things that really matter are eventually done and then they're sort of undone, and governments pay the price for that. But your words of encouragement, I think, are really important. Don't give up. That we can make things better. We need to be determined, we need to be clear, and we need to be principled. And it's really good to hear from you, and it's largely because I think it's very good for us at CIS to hear from colleagues in other think tanks overseas. The Adam Smith Institute is a very significant think tank in the UK. I think it helps us to feel that we are not working alone in this country, and that whilst we face similar problems, we can take heart from the fact that colleagues overseas are working in similar environments, facing similar issues, and that we can learn from one another. The principles of classical liberalism remain important to us here. They remain important to you. We need to remind ourselves what those principles are. We need to adhere to them. We need to stand up for them and proclaim them with confidence. So, Eamonn, I'd like to thank you very much indeed on behalf of the CIS for coming tonight, for your remarks, for your encouragement. And ladies and gentlemen, I would ask you to join me in thanking Eamonn for his remarks.
For decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice working hard to promote sound liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.